Good day, everyone. We are the group that is assigned to report about Karl Marx. So our group has 4 presenters, namely Mr. Jolie B. Hermogilla, Ms. Lorgena M. Artizano, Ms. Mary Jean G. Godito, and yours truly, Ms. Genevieve France D. Dicdicu. So first things first, let's talk about Karl Marx's biography. So Karl Marx's real name is Karl Heinrich Marx. He was born on 5th of May 1818 in Trier, Germany. Marx is widely referred to as a philosopher, a political economist, and a journalist. But he is best known as a revolutionary whose works inspired the foundation of many communist regimes in the 12th century. He was married to Jenny von Westphalen, and his close friend and fellow scholar was Friedrich Engels. So Karl Marx died on 14th of March 1883 in London and was buried in the Highgate Cemetery. As a young man, he spent most of his time in Belgium and spent most of his productive years in London. Next, Marxism. So what is Marxism? We all know that Marxism is a political and economic theories of Karl Marx and Engels, later developed by their followers to form the basis for the theory and practice of communism. It examines the effects of capitalism on labor, productivity, and economic development, and argues for a worker revolution to overturn capitalism in favor of communism. So, Marxism as a codified body of thought only came into existence after Marx's death in 1883. It was a product of the attempt, notably by Marx's lifelong collaborator Engels, the German socialist leader Karl Katzkai, and the Russian theoretician George Plekhanov. So Karl Johann Katzkai is a German socialist writer and editor, while Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov is a Russian philosopher and leader of the Mensheviks. So the purpose was to condense Marx's ideas and theories into a systematic and comprehensive worldview that suited the needs of the growing socialist movement. Engels' Anti-Theory written in 1876 while Marx was still alive is sometimes seen as the first work of Marxist orthodoxy, emphasizing the need for adherence to an authoritative interpretation of Marx's work. So, Anti-Theory is a powerful introduction to historical materialism, Marxist economics, and dialectics. So, there are at least 3 forms of Marxism that can be identified, and those are classical, orthodox communism, and modern. Let's talk first about classical Marxism. So, the core of classical Marxism, the Marxism of Marx. It is a philosophy of history that outlines why capitalism is doomed and why socialism is destined to replace it. This is, however, philosophy of particular kind. As Marx put it in his thesis in Fire Back, so Fire Back is 11 short philosophical notes written by Karl Marx as a basic outline for the first chapter of the book, The German Ideology, in 1845. So it is best remembered for the epigrammatic 11th thesis and final line, which says, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." He therefore saw his work as the theory of society and a socialist political project. Indeed, the sophistication and complexity of Marx's writings derive in part of his unwillingness to separate theory from practice and his belief that as human beings shape their world, in the process they have also helping to shape themselves. So, before we proceed to Marx versus Hegel, Karl Marx talked about alienation. So, what is alienation? Alienation is becoming an enemy to oneself. Karl Marx thinks that capitalism alienates us from our best, self. We're meant to be free. We're meant to be creative. We're meant to be other-oriented and socialized. Capitalism, as he knew it, he felt violated all of this and lead to this very deep alienation whereby my freedom is lost, creativity, and the sense of connection to the wider world has lost. That alienation is going to give rise to rebellion and revolution, and Marx wants to encourage that. So, what made Marx's approach different from the other social thinkers was that he subscribed to what Engels called the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism, rejecting the idealism of the German philosopher Hegel. So Marx didn't really directly reject Hegel. In fact, Hegel was influenced by Hegel in his dialectical materialism. Hegel is his teacher as well as Ludwig Feuerbach. So Hegel is a philosopher who believed that history amounted to the unfolding of the so-called world spirit. Marx held material circumstances to be fundamental to all forms of social and historical development. This reflected the belief that the production of the means of subsistence is the most crucial of all human activities. Since humans cannot survive without food, water, shelter, and so on, the way in which these are produced conditions all other aspects of life. In short, social being determines consciousness. And that will be all in my part. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am Longina Ortizano and I'll be discussing the mode of production, historical materialism, the different stages of Marxism, communism, and the difference between bourgeoisie and proletariat. And mode of production. So mode of production, everything that goes into the production of the necessities of life, including the productive forces, like labor, instruments, and raw materials, and the relations of production, the social structures that regulate the relation between humans and the production of goods. According to Marx and Engels, for individuals, the mode of production is a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and how they produce. The mode of production is a central concept in Marxism and is defined as the way a society is organized to produce goods and services. It consists of two major aspects, which is forces of production and relations of production. The forces of production include all of the elements that are brought together in production, from land, raw material, and fuel to human skill, and labor to machinery, tools, and factories. The relations of production include relationships among people and people's relationship to the forces of production through which decisions are made about what to do with the results. In Marxist theory, mode of production concept is used to illustrate the historical differences between different societies and economies, and Marx commented on Neolithic, Asiatic, slavery or ancient, feudalism, and capitalism. So next, Marx's theory of history are simply saying the historical materialism. So it sounds complicated and abstract, but it's really a rather fancy way of saying that society's economic organization fundamentally determines its social institutions. So it's centered around the idea that forms of society rise and fall as they further and then hinder the development of human productive power. Marx sees the historical process as proceeding through a necessary series of modes of production, characterized by class struggle, culminating in communism. It also argued that human societies and their cultural institutions like religion, law, morality, etc. were the outgrowth of collective economic activity. So next is the stages of Marxism. So in German ideology, Marx identified four stages. But there's the last one, which is the lower stage of communism, which is the socialism. So first, let's discuss about primitive communism, or tribal society in which the material scarcity provided the principal source of conflict. So during this stage, the concept of private property begins to develop. With the development of private property, we find here for the first time same conditions, which we shall find again only on an extensive scale with modern private property. Men perform the same economic function hunter-gatherer. They work together in order to survive. There was no private property and there were no classes. Eventually, the most successful hunter gained power and control over the others. The second epoch is slavery, covering classical or ancient societies and characterized by conflict between master and slave. Despite the brutalities of the slave system, it gave rise to a new and more advanced productive forces. The strong man ruled. He began by owning all the land, but when threatened by outsiders, he would grant land to others in return for military services. A new land-owning aristocracy was therefore created. So what is the connection between slavery with today's world? Engel's answer would be, it was slavery that first made possible the division of labor between agriculture and industry on a larger scale, and thereby also Hellenism, the flowering of the ancient world. Without slavery, no Greek art and science. Without slavery, no Roman Empire. But without the basis laid by Grecian culture and the Roman Empire, also there is no modern Europe. We should never forget that our whole economic, political, and intellectual development presupposes a state of things in which slavery was as necessary as it was universally recognized. In this sense, we're entitled to say, without the slavery of antiquity, there's no modern socialism. So the third one is feudalism, marked by antagonism between landowners and serfs. The new productive forces acquired under slave-owning mode of production demanded for the future progress a type of society, a new framework of property relations in which they could develop unhindered. Under feudalism, production was a very largely individual, each producer working for himself where possible, owning his own means of production as well, the product of his labor which he could exchange for other products necessary for subsistence. So then the next one is capitalism, dominated by the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the wealthy merchants and factory owners, which is the bourgeoisie, obtained political power and exploited the workers, which are the proletariat. As the proletariat became politically aware, they would rise up and overthrow the bourgeois government. This new class of propertyless urban had nothing to sell but their ability to work and deprived of their own means of production. They were forced to work for the new capitalist class, the owners of the means of production. So under capitalism, many people do not fall into the category of workers or employers. Architects, doctors, small businessmen, working farmers, small contractors, etc. Those on big incomes identify with the capitalists. But mostly such people form a petty bourgeoisie, not workers, but not exploiters. They do not and cannot play a decisive economic role. In industrial capitalism, that is played by the industrial working class. So the last one would be socialism. So there would be a dictatorship of the proletariat as workers' organizations redistributed food, goods, and services fairly according to need, and profits were shared by all. The middle classes would come to understand that equality was superior to private property. So in this epoch, the class struggle of workers against capitalists is closely, in fact, indissolubly linked with the national liberation struggle of the oppressed people to free themselves from imperialist domination. So next, communism, a classless society. So the manifesto emphasized the importance of class struggle in every historical society and the dangerous instability capitalism created, though it did not outline the basic requirement for a communist society. So Marx constructed his vision of communism out of the human technological possibilities already visible in his time. Given the priorities that would be adopted by a new socialist society, the programs introduced by the victorious working class to deal with the problems left by the old society and the revolution would unleash a social dynamic whose general resorts Marx believed could be charted beforehand. So, in this sense, Marx declares we do not anticipate the world dogmatically, but rather wish to find the new world through the criticism of the old. So, like the projections Marx made of the future of capitalism itself, however, what he foresaw for communism is no more than highly probable. Marx, whose excessive optimism is often mistaken for crude determinism, would not deny the same for barbarism is another alternative. But a socialist victory, either through revolution or at the polls, is considered far more likely. So next. Capitalism equals class conflict equals exploitation. So they're also alienated from the process of labor because most are forced to work under the supervision of foremen or managers. In addition, work is not social. Individuals are encouraged to be self-interested and are therefore alienated from fellow human beings. Finally, workers are alienated from themselves. Labor itself is reduced to a mere commodity and work becomes a depersonalized activity instead of a creative and fulfilling one. In Marx's later work, however, capitalism is more often analyzed in terms of class conflict and exploitation. So, the last one would be bourgeoisie and proletariat. So, what is the difference between bourgeoisie and proletariat? So, a bourgeoisie, that the social class that has come to own the means of production and has come to sort of dominate the industrial and the factory system. So, the economy is making a transition from a more rural form based on economy now to the industrial. So they are the owners of the means of production. The bourgeoisie are the minions of the 1%. They buy into the program of the elite in order to survive well, without necessarily being conscious of that. They follow the rules on the assumption that there is nothing else. They cannot deviate from business as usual. They must send their children to the best schools. They must drive newer, better cars. They must shop the best stores and eat at the best restaurants. They live their lives for the life. So proletariat are the working class by definition. Traditionally, according to Marx, day labor is abused by the owners of the means of the production, which are no longer factories unless they are in China or other part of Asia. But workplace like
Good day everyone, I'm Mary Jane Gudita and I assigned to discuss about the nature of capitalism, the first and second theory, and the orthodox communism. So let's start about the nature of capitalism. So capitalism defined as an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. Central characteristics of capitalism include capital accumulation, competitive markets, and price system. We also have private property and the recognition of property rights, voluntary exchange, and wage labor. So here for our slide, the nature of capitalism. Marx was concerned not only to highlight the inherent instability of capitalism, based as it is on the irreconcilable class conflict, but also to analyze the nature of capitalist development. In particular, he drew attention to its tendency to experience deepening economic crisis. Each crisis will be more severe than the last because Marx calculated in the long term the rate of profit would fall. So further tensions would result from a tendency towards a monopolization, the concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands, and the absorption of all other classes into the ranks of the proletariat. So the exploited masses, united by a common economic interest, would thus come to constitute the overwhelming majority in any capitalist society. Okay, the next slide will talk about the first theory. So the first is expressed in the often quoted dictum from the Communist Manifesto. The executive of the modern state is the committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. So from this perspective, the state is clearly dependent upon society and acts as nothing more than an instrument of oppression wielded by the economically dominant class. So for our next slide, we have here the famous quote of Karl Marx that goes, "The production of too many useful things results in too many useless people." So this suggests that there is a great problem with the society that we live in. production and the division of labor yield detrimental consequences to the contemporary world. Given that the 21st century system of production dominates our lives to such an extent that we become reliant on it, so it is inevitable that humanity will become useless. So this implies that our current system of production and consumption presents two great consequences. So we have the first is that we are driven to conformity. As a result, people become conducive to standardization, and they cannot be unique individuals because self-worth becomes a measure of what one can consume. So the latter is that our system prevents us from being able to critically thinking about alternatives. So the risk is that people lose a sense of the control that they have in society, making them vulnerable to manipulation and inevitably useless. So that's it. So we have the next slide here. We have the second theory. So a second, a more complex and subtle theory of the state is found in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. In this, Marx allowed that the state could enjoy what has come to be seen as relative autonomy. So this relative autonomy in Althusserian Marxist theory, the relative independence of the superstructure of society, including ideology and culture. So from the economic, or that's techno-economic base, in contrast to the stance in classical Marxism, that the latter determines the former, a stance similar to that of the technological determinism. So that's relative autonomy from the ruling class. So its principal role being to mediate between conflicting classes and so perpetuate the class system. So in either case, however, the proletariat has no alternative. In order to defeat capitalism, the state machine that upholds it must first be overthrown. So for my last slide to be discussed, this is the orthodox communism. So this is the second form of Marxism. So orthodox, it's defined as a person or their views, especially religious or political ones, or other beliefs or practices conforming to what is generally or traditionally accepted as right or true. Now, however, on the other hand, let's have communism that is based upon the ideas of common ownership and the absence of social classes, money, and the states. So we have here the Russian Revolution and its consequences dominated the image of communism in the 20th century. The Bolshevik Party, led by V.I. Lenin, that's Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a coup d'etat in October 1917, and the following year adopted the name Communist Party. So as the first successful communist revolutionaries, the Bolshevik leaders enjoyed unquestionably authority within the communist world. At least until the 1950s, communist parties set up elsewhere accepted the ideological leadership of Moscow and joined the Communist International, or Comintern, founded in 1919. So that's the end.
Hi, my name is Julie Hermvila, and in continuation with previous topics, we are going to dig the difference on theories of communism and more about Karl Marx's contribution on political philosophy. Karl Marx was a German philosopher during the 19th century. He worked primarily in the realm of political philosophy and was a famous advocate for communism. As previously discussed or mentioned in the previous presenter, the key characteristics of Marxism in philosophy are its materialism and its commitment to political practice as the end goal of all thought. Theory is also about a hustle of proletariat and their reprimand of the bourgeoisie. The death of heroes is like sunset. History repeats itself, first as tragedy, second as farce. These are few of Marx's important quotes or philosophical quotes in life. We're going now to tackle the differences. The communist regime established in Eastern Europe after 1945 in China in 1949 and Cuba in 1959 were consciously modeled upon the structure of Soviet Union. Thus, Soviet communism became dominant model of communist rule, and the ideas of Marxism, Leninism became the ruling ideology of communist world. However, 20th century communism differed significantly from the ideas and expectations of Marx and Engels. As we move along, to understand it deeper, we are going to show you some video clips so that we would have a better understanding of the significance of Marx's theories. Marxism in practice. In the first place, although the communist parties that developed in 20th century were founded upon the theories of classical Marxism, they were forced to adapt the task of winning and retaining political power. Communism in that sense was Marxism in practice. 20th century communist leaders had in particular to give greater attention in issues such as leadership, political organization, and economic management than Marx had done. Second, the communist regimes were shaped by historical circumstances in which they developed. Communist parties did not achieve power as Marx had anticipated in the developed capitalist states of Western Europe, but in backward, largely rural countries such as Russia and China. Modern. While Marxism, or more usually Marxism-Leninism, was turned into secular religion by the orthodox communist regimes of Eastern Europe and elsewhere, a more subtle and complex form of Marxism developed in Western Europe, referred to as modern Marxism. Western Marxism or Neo-Marxism this amounted to an attempt to revise or recast the classical ideas of Marx while remaining faithful to certain Marxist principle or aspect of Marxist methodology. We're now going to show you a short video, and after this we're going to also have the short video for conclusion. The character of modern Marxism. The two principal factors shape the character of modern Marxism. First, the Marxist prediction about imminent collapse of capitalism failed to materialize. Modern Marxists were forced to re-examine conventional class analysis. In particular, they took greater interest in Hegelian ideas in the stress upon man, the creator, found in Marx's early writing. In other words, human beings came to be seen as makers of history, not simply puppets controlled by impersonal material forces. In short, the class struggles was longer treated and in the beginning and end and social analysis. Second, modern Marxists were usually the ads with sometimes profoundly repelled but a Bolshevik model of orthodox communism. Not only were they critical of its authoritarian and repressive character, but they also recoiled from its mechanistic and avowed scientific pretensions. The reification. The Hungarian Marxist George Lukács, 1885-1971, was one of the first to present Marxism as humanistic philosophy, emphasizing the process of reification, through which capitalism dehumanized workers by reducing them to passive objects or marketable commodities. Antonio Gramsci drew attention to the degree to which the class system is upheld not simply by unequal economic and political power, but also bourgeoisie hegemony. the spiritual and the cultural supremacy of the ruling class, brought about through the spread of bourgeoisie values and beliefs via civil society, the media, churches, youth movements, trade unions, and so on. So Marx believed that capitalism is based on commodities, which are things bought and sold. In Marx's view, an employee's labor is form of commodity. However, since ordinary laborers do not own the means of production such as factories, buildings, and materials, they have little power in capitalist economic system. Marx also believed saw in capitalism as a progressive historical stage that would eventually stagnate due to internal contradiction and be followed by socialism. They believe that private ownership of means of production enriches capitalists at the expense of workers. Now, I'd like to show you the videos or short video clips to have a better comprehension or understanding of what's Marxism and Karl Marx political philosophical contribution on philosophy.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet we're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx. This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships. Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer. Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property. He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels. Mostly, Marx wrote about capitalism, the type of economy that dominates the Western world. It was, in his day, still getting going, and Marx was one of its most intelligent and perceptive critics. These were some of the problems he identified with it. Modern work is alienated. One of Marx's greatest insights is that work can be one of the sources of our greatest joys. But in order to be fulfilled at work, Marx wrote that workers need to see themselves in the objects they have created. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labour offers us a chance to externalise what's good inside us. But this is increasingly rare in the modern world. Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialised. Specialised jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity. Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence. Modern work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology. And yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out. Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the labourers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce. However much one dresses up the fundamentals, Marx insists that at its crudest, capitalism means paying a worker one price for doing something and then selling it to somebody else at a much higher price. Profit is the fancy term for exploitation. Capitalism is very unstable. Marx proposed that capitalist systems are characterized by a series of crises. Every crisis is dressed up by capitalists as being somehow freakish and rare and soon to be the last one. Far from it, argued Marx. Crises are endemic to capitalism, and they're caused by something rather odd. The fact that we're able to produce too much, far more than anyone needs to consume. Capitalist crises are crises of abundance, rather than, as in the past, crises of shortage. Our factories and systems are so efficient we could give everyone on this planet a car, a house, access to a decent school and a hospital. And that's what so enraged Marx, but also made him so hopeful too. Few of us actually need to work because the modern economy is so productive. But rather than seeing this need not to work as the freedom it is, we complain about it masochistically and describe it by a pejorative word, unemployment. We should call it freedom. There's so much unemployment for a good and deeply admirable reason, because we're so good at making things efficiently. We're not all needed at the coalface. But in that case, we should, thought Marx, make leisure admirable. We should redistribute the wealth of the massive corporations that make so much surplus money and give it to everyone. This is, in its own way, as beautiful a dream as Jesus' promise of heaven, but a good deal more realistic sounding. Capitalism is bad for capitalists. Marx didn't think that capitalists were evil. For example, he was acutely aware of the sorrows and secret agonies that lay behind bourgeois marriage. Marx argued that marriage was actually an extension of business, and that the bourgeois family was fraught with tension, oppression, and resentment, with people staying together not for love, but for financial reasons. Marx believed that the capitalist system forces everyone to put economic interests at the heart of their lives, so that they can no longer know deep, honest relationships. He called this psychological tendency commodity fetishism, Warenfetischismus, because it makes us value things that have no objective value. He wanted people to be freed from financial constraint so that they could, at last, start to make sensible, healthy choices in their relationships. The 20th century feminist answer to the oppression of women has been to argue that women should simply be able to go out to work. But Marx's answer was more subtle. This feminist insistence merely perpetuates human slavery. The point isn't that women should imitate the sufferings of their male colleagues. It's that men and women should have the permanent option to enjoy leisure. Why don't we all think a bit more like Marx? An important aspect of Marx's work is that he proposes that there's an insidious, subtle way in which the economic system colours the sort of ideas that we end up having. The economy generates what Marx termed an ideology. A capitalist society is one where most people, rich and poor, believe all sorts of things that are really just value judgments that relate back to the economic system. For example, that a person who doesn't work is worthless, that leisure beyond a few weeks a year is sinful, that more belongings will make us happier, and that worthwhile things and people will invariably make money. In short, one of the biggest evils of capitalism is not that there are corrupt people at the top. This is true in any human hierarchy. But that capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent. Marx didn't only outline what was wrong with capitalism. We also get glimpses of what Marx wanted the ideal utopian future to be like. In his Communist Manifesto, he describes a world without private property or inherited wealth, with a steeply graduated income tax, centralized control of the banking, communication, and transport industries, and free public education. Marx also expected that communist society would allow people to develop lots of different sides of their natures. In communist society, it's possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. After Marx moved to London, he was supported by his friend and intellectual partner Friedrich Engels, a wealthy man whose father owned a cotton plant in Manchester. Engels covered Marx's debts and made sure his works were published. Capitalism paid for communism. The two men even wrote each other adoring poetry. Marx was not a well-regarded or popular intellectual in his day. Respectable, conventional people of Marx's day would have laughed at the idea that his ideas could remake the world. Yet, just a few decades later, they did. His writings became the keystone for some of the most important ideological movements of the 20th century. But Marx was like a brilliant doctor in the early days of medicine. He could recognize the nature of the disease, although he had no idea how to go about curing it. At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles. But we need to go out and find the cures that really will work. As Marx himself declared, and we deeply agree, philosophers until now have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
Starting with conjectural premise that social change occurs as a result of the struggle between different classes with society who contradict one another, a Marxist would conclude that capitalism exploits and oppresses the proletariat. Therefore, capitalism will inevitably lead to proletarian revolution. That concludes our report on Karl Marx theories and his contribution to political philosophy and economic history. I'd like you to watch the article in Teen Vogue on YouTube titled "Who is Karl Marx?" a video interview with Bishop Robert Barron, as he explains why millennials tend to idolize Karl Marx ideology. This has been Karl Marx Group. Thank you for watching.